Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Interdisciplinary Cluster on Transnational Democracy in the 21st Century and by the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. My name is Phil Kostoka. I'm professor in the SPS department, and I co-convened the cluster together with Professor Calypso Nikolaidis from the Transnational School of Governance, who unfortunately cannot be with us here physically, but she may join us online. And this seminar is also organized by Professor Waltraud Čerkle, who has a joint appointment in the SPS department and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, and who is with us in the room. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jean-Paul Faguet, professor of Political Economy of Development and the London School of Economics. Jean-Paul's research fields include political economy, comparative politics, economic development, and economic history. His research has been published in leading journals such as World Development and with academic book publishers such as Oxford University Press or Michigan University Press. Jean-Paul is a world-renowned leader and expert on decentralization. He has been the chair of the Decentralization Task Force at Columbia's University Initiative for Policy Dialogue, among other things. And today he will present a new book on decentralization that he co-edited with Professor Sarmista Pal from the University of Surrey, and the book is entitled Decentralized Governance, Crafting Effective Democracies Around the World. Jean-Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm honored to be here in this room with scholars of such standing and also the online participants. Let me start off by thanking my co-editor, Professor Sarmista Pal of Surrey in the UK, and also all 24 of the contributing scholars who wrote the chapters that comprise this book. What I'm going to try to do today is give you an overview of some of the key themes and the empirical evidence on the basis of which we make various arguments. The book is 370 pages long, so it would be impossible to summarize it, impossible even to summarize all of the arguments, but I will try to summarize some of the overarching themes and then point you in the direction of where in the book these themes are developed for you to follow up if you choose. Let me begin with the setting. Decentralization is a big deal across all of the world's regions, cultures, bureaucratic and political systems, income levels, etc. It's not just a topic in development studies. It's not just a topic in developed country or OECD country studies. It's really worldwide. By the early 2000s, those of us working in the field thought that the wave was cresting. I was a brand new PhD, a brand new assistant professor at the LSE. I had written my dissertation on this topic. And I thought, well, I have to publish as much as I can, as quickly as I can, because surely the wave is cresting and it'll become passé and people will be bored and attention will move on to other things soon after. This was about the time when Bardhan and Mukherjee brought out their book, which is the one over here on the left, looking at local governance in developing countries. This was a seminal book that took stock of what we knew about the different types of decentralization throughout the developing world. To my surprise and the surprise of many of us, the wave kept building. It didn't crest, it didn't break. There were more reforms at deeper levels of decentralization, deepening federalist kinds of reforms with greater creativity about the technologies and the methods involved to devolve power and resources to lower levels of government. It just kept going. There were follow-on reforms in countries that had already decentralized. Simultaneously, a huge amount of new subnational data has come out since the late 90s and early 2000s, finer grained data of much higher quality, not just on fiscal flows, which is what we all worked on in the late 1990s, what I did my PhD largely on, but also political, social, and cultural variables at the subnational level became available across very many developing countries to match some data that was available or data along those lines available in some developed countries already, hugely increasing the spectrum of countries across which you could do studies like this. and permitting us to ask really difficult questions that earlier generations of scholars hadn't been able to ask. So what we do in this book is to take advantage of this evidence, to take stock again, 25 years later, of the state of knowledge on decentralization in the world today, with a special focus on governance and democracy building in developing countries. And so there you have some of the key features of the books. One is that the empirics are just much more sophisticated than previous generations, including myself, going back to my PhD, were able to do, because the data is better and it's more fine-grained, it's more multidimensional. And so there's a richness there that people just didn't have before. The third point is that we really focus on governance and democracy building in developing countries, including in partially democratic and even non-democratic countries like China. We can come back to that a little bit later on. China is an autocratic communist dictatorship that has a stunning amount of democratic practice at the subnational level, in particular in local governments, where you have fully elected, non-partisan, but fully elected local governments in the context of a dictatorial national government. And then lastly, I want to underline that this book was published, so here it is, and you can see on the cover, this book was published by the LSE Press, which is a new ambitious press, university press, allied with my home university, with the London School of Economics, that has an open access model, meaning this book is fully available for free to everyone in the world immediately, with access to the internet. So anybody with a device that's connected can download it immediately at no cost. All of it, or just the chapters that you're interested in. Or if you'd like a physical copy like this, you can order it and it comes to you at basically the marginal cost of reproduction. So it costs something like 30 euros instead of 130 euros. Because the idea that we had is to, having made the huge intellectual and sort of personal investment in doing all of this research over several years in producing the book, is to get the ideas out and make them available, especially to people in developing countries. We can come back to this later on if there's interest. It's sort of a sub-theme. But my colleagues and Sarmist and I were in particular interested in just openness and reach and getting the ideas out there. So let me talk to you a little bit about the thematic range of the book, and also the empirical range, the countries and regions that we look at. And then I'll step back and try to develop some of the overarching themes. So the book begins with a synthetic chapter. Let me see if I can make this a bit small, just for the moment. There we go. Okay, good. The book begins with a synthetic chapter, as is often the case. It tries to bring together the key insights from all of the rest of the chapters. Then part one looks at 50 years of decentralization studies and tries to take stock of where the literature was, what the insights were, what the kind of state of knowledge and policy recommendations were in chapter two, which is mine, around the year 2000, followed on by a chapter by Dilip Mukherjee, the same Mukherjee of Bardhan Mukherjee that I pointed out before, who then writes a magisterial chapter surveying all of the newfangled real policy experiments at decentralized targeting and transfer programs using new kinds of technologies and new approaches that weren't available in the 20th century, but that have come on in the last 25 years or so, and are being piloted all over the world in really interesting ways. I'll say more about that in a moment. But so there are a lot of studies of these, there are a lot of these programs, there are a lot of studies of these programs, and Dilip surveys that literature to sort of update the state of knowledge today on these themes. Then the following section of the book is 5 chapters on politics, where the first of these, chapter 4, is another sort of overarching, another survey chapter that looks across countries at the theme of partial decentralization by Devarajan and Kamani. And then we have a series of focus country studies of Pakistan, China, Indonesia, and Kenya that look at different aspects of targeting, of national to subnational governmental level interactions, issues about community heterogeneity in the context of fiscal decentralization, or rather backwards, fiscal decentralization in the context of community heterogeneity in Indonesia, and so on. And then the third part is mechanism design. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, what we mean by mechanism design, but these are basically non-political, more bureaucratic or technocratic mechanisms of resource allocation, and of organizing intergovernmental relations, and the effects of these mechanism design sorts of strategies on things that we care about. Again, chapter 9 begins with an overview, a survey of recent research on this topic, on this set of issues, and then we have focus country studies on Ghana, Bangladesh, and Colombia. So a synoptic overview of the book looks graphically like this. Decentralization can affect a number of things that we care about through a political channel, where the dynamics involve things like increased contestation and citizen participation, ethno-religious homogeneity, elite capture, clientelism, in authoritarian, but also in democratic regimes. All of these things that I mentioned operate differently in authoritarian versus democratic regimes, but they're present in both, including things like elite capture or clientelism. Or decentralization can operate via a mechanism design, a non-political, more technocratic sort of channel. And some of the themes involved, some of the issues involved are corruption monitoring, information collection, increased accountability or not. And via either of these channels, and really through the combination of both channels in real countries that we care about, the outcomes that we study are governance quality, public goods provision, and economic performance broadly. And the kinds of geographic coverage that we have include country studies of China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Colombia, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Kenya, and then the chapters that look across countries, so multi-country studies, mainly using databases, and so, looking at countries in the tens or even more than 100 at a time. So let's move on to some of the big themes that we look at. Up to now, I've sort of described what the book is like, so let me now try to get at some of the lessons that we draw. The first thing is that decentralization is not a thing. It's not one thing. It's not a policy reform that's a switch that you can flip, like you turn on a light or you choose to change your policy with respect to road construction or primary education, for example, which might operate conceivably more like a switch, and you dial it up or you dial it down. Sincere decentralization, instead, is something that generates a heterogeneity of responses across all of the subnational units in a country that chooses to decentralize, that are as different from one another, the responses, the outcomes are as heterogeneous one from another as the underlying districts or provinces or municipalities are different from one another. And that's what we should expect. This idea is tied to a wealth of conceptual and methodological insights that we're only really beginning to comprehend in recent years. For over 50 years, researchers ask questions along the lines of, is decentralization good or bad for X, where X is something you care about? X can be primary education outcomes, access to primary health care, inflation, corruption, unit costs in infrastructure construction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any of a number of things that you might care about. The questions that were asked were, is decentralization good or bad for this X that I'm choosing to focus on? These studies approach it as if it were a technocratic issue and as if it were a monotonic technocratic issue. They treat the specifics of reform, how many decisions about how to unpick centralized public services and decentralize which components of service provision to what levels of governance, as if these decisions were given, as if it were simple and the answers were obvious, and as if all countries were doing it in a similar way. And that's just wrong. On each one of those points, all of that is wrong. The correct answer to any question, is decentralization good or bad for X, is yes, of course it is. So as X, let's take primary education. And my answer is decentralization is good for primary education in any country that decentralizes. No? And the correct answer to the question, is decentralization bad for primary education, is yes, of course. It's also simultaneously bad for primary education in the same country under the same decentralization reform. Because a country will have hundreds or thousands of subnational units, and in any country that decentralizes at any moment in time, primary education will get better in some places and will get worse in other places. And in a third, often the largest number of places, it neither gets very clearly better or worse. It sort of muddles along more or less as it was before under centralization, right? Because we should expect a heterogeneity response. We should expect different things to happen, because what decentralization does is to let loose local dynamics, and resources and decisions are taken for better or for worse in different places as according to the characteristics of those places. It's not a guarantee that you get good outcomes, and just like it's not a guarantee that you get bad outcomes. The assumption that decentralization is simple, clear, and monotonic, that decentralization has an effect on that X that I mentioned, was always a methodological convenience. It wasn't a point of principle or belief by the previous generations of researchers that operated in that way. I think it was largely a result of data unavailability, and of the methods that they had at their disposal. All the same, it colored the empirical literature that they produced. It affected what questions were asked and how the studies that they did were structured. Only recently have researchers begun to internalize that the many decisions about how to decentralize precisely which state functions to which level of government are not fundamentally technocratic issues. They're political issues everywhere, all the time. And we have to start from that assumption. Which takes us on to the second big theme, which is politics. So decisions to decentralize or not, are taken by leaders who seek political advantage. In a democracy, that's obvious. The president, the prime minister, the ministers of their respective portfolios are seeking political advantage when they declare that they want to decentralize, and then in the ways in which they decentralize or not, right? But it's also the case in autocratic systems. The nature of the political advantage may be different. It's not electoral, but they nonetheless seek a political advantage. Decentralizations are implemented or not by officials whose power and status will be directly affected by these reforms. This is the point that Devarajan and Kamani make very powerfully in their chapter 4. Done correctly, decentralization can improve the democratic accountability and responsiveness of governments by changing the incentives that officials face from upward pointing to the center towards downward pointing incentives towards local voters in democratic systems, even in systems like China, for example. This is one of the simplest but most powerful lessons of 50 years of reform. Decentralization ultimately affects not only local, but also national public goods, as well as the responsiveness and accountability of the entire state, not just the localities or the provinces or the departmental or state governments in which it's implemented. Done correctly, decentralization should make local governments better attuned to local economic conditions, and so it should boost economic growth. But this done correctly hides enormously more than it reveals. So there are all kinds of assumptions that are built into that simple phrase, that innocent sounding phrase, done correctly. As I mentioned, countries decentralize in very different ways, devolving different sets of powers over different public services to different levels of subnational government, with different revenue-raising powers and different degrees of subnational democracy. Analyzing, looking across cases of decentralization sort of defined and realized in this way, leads Devarajan and Kamani to the striking conclusion that most decentralizations in the real world are partial. They are not only not full expressions of some similar underlying blueprint, they're not even full expressions of the many diverse blueprints that countries try to implement. Why is this? This is because public officials love talking about decentralization, but they really hate doing it. No? Ask yourself, how many politicians, now by definition, by construction, I suppose I should say, decentralization involves higher level politicians devolving, passing on, transferring power and resources to subaltern level, to lower level officials that they cannot entirely control. right? If they can entirely control them, it's not decentralization, it's something else. It's deconcentration, delegation. It's a different kind of reform, but it's not decentralization like we define it here and what most of the literature refers to as decentralization, which is some form of devolution. So ask yourself, how many higher level, how many national, to be simple about it, how many national level politicians get into politics to give away money and power to people they can't control? Is this why you go into government? Is this why you devote your life and a huge amount of energy, years of your life, to playing in politics and trying to win at the game, climb the greasy pole of power to the top? And then having reached the top, you turn around and you give away power and resources to other people? Maybe Nelson Mandela does this, but there are very few Nelson Mandelas in the world. No? And so most politicians don't get into it for that. And having made it, they don't then turn around and do that. So if they do it, it's because it's functional to them. It's because it's convenient to them in some powerful way. And then that way explains how and why they do it. So most decentralizations as a result of this sort of logic are incomplete in the sense that economic theory would predict, and often feature large mismatches between the devolved responsibilities and accountability that a particular program encompasses. These partial decentralizations will often nonetheless represent a political equilibrium in the countries involved that balance competing forces that make it difficult to change these programs at the margin. Technocrats, I used to work at the World Bank a very long time ago. And so people at places like the World Bank will often do an analysis of how you can make decentralization work better in a particular country without taking into account that the problems that they've identified in this country are a political equilibrium, and changing that political equilibrium is very difficult and may have unintended consequences in some other dimension that are actually worse than leaving the problems there in the first place. But Devaraj and Kamani point out that politics also provides very strong grounds for hope. And so I want to end this part of my comments on this hopeful note. Increased contestation across the world in very many countries that have decentralized in local elections are generating better, improved service delivery. Why? Because decentralization often leads to more and better people getting involved in local politics and local administration. It helps to shine a brighter light on local governance, and it brings more information about needs and wants of local people into the public realm and makes that useful for public decision-making. As a result of this, citizens are better able and willing to judge officials' performance in a way that tends to lead to better accountability, and we can empirically show has led to greater accountability compared to the previous centralized systems in a number of countries across the globe. Now, the third big theme is mechanism design. We have a set of chapters that look at mechanism design, the premise of which is that there's a great deal to successful governance beyond politics. Politics is hugely important. I spent a large part of my life in political science, but it's not the only thing. There are other important things going on. Effective decentralization implies adapting structures, rules, norms, and behaviors to new actors and dynamics that a centralized system may not have contemplated. And so all of these things wrapped together fall under the rubric of mechanism design. Chapter 2 lays out in detail which powers theory recommends we should decentralize to which levels of government, and how to design tax and transfer systems in ways that fund them adequately. In Chapter 3, Mukherjee considers recent policy innovations that are mechanism design, more technocratic kinds of innovations to improve monitoring and supervision in ways that he shows have changed the game in fundamental ways across the world, in a number of countries across the world. So to get at this idea of what is mechanism design, it's probably better if I use some examples. So for example, in India, the use of biometric identification cards and their very famous Aadhaar system of taking biometric information from 1.4 billion Indians and then issuing each Indian citizen with a citizen card that has biometrically identifying information about each individual on that card. So in India, these ID cards are being used to verify employment beneficiaries in ways that reduce program leakage and improve targeting to people who need this sort of assistance, who are under or unemployed. It reduces program leakages to ghosts, to non-existent people, dead people, and other non-deserving beneficiaries by 41%. Imagine a nationwide program of transferring benefits to the poor that reduces the cost of that program by 41% and improves targeting. It's an absolutely stunning outcome. Additionally, beneficiaries were paid more quickly, and reported earnings of these beneficiaries rose 24% at no extra cost whatsoever to the program. They reduced the waste, and there was no additional cost to a program where these benefits existed. In other countries, in a number of other countries, non-elite citizens have been hired as monitors to beat down elite capture of public benefits. Program management is contracted out in some cases to NGOs, in other cases even to private firms, as a way of helping to suppress elite capture of these benefits. In a third set of countries, for example, a third example, they use formula-bound programs that actually reduce the authority of locally elected officials in ways that tie their hands and help the benefits and the transfers or the public investment to reach the target beneficiaries, instead of letting it leak out or get reallocated to less deserving people. And so, stepping back from all of these examples, I'm just invoking three quick sets of examples. There are many more in this section of the book. Dilip suggests a big data approach. This is blue sky thinking. This is his sort of synthesis of one way that we might go forward successfully. A big data approach that uses survey data to predict the level of poverty of each individual in a country, and then target those poor individual by individual, distributing benefits via a nationwide ID system with biometric identification combined with electronic transfers to low-cost bank accounts or mobile phone banking. Excuse me. Such a system could improve pro-poor targeting significantly at very low cost compared to existing systems over the last 50 years, while reducing losses, reducing leakage, and also distortions that are due to things like capture, corruption, and inefficiency. These are all examples of non-political technocratic alternatives to decentralized politics that achieve some of the same outcomes. So lastly, I want to leave lots of time for questions, so if I can just try to sum up. Decentralization is not in itself a good or a bad thing. A lot of the previous generation, really 2 generations of studies, set out to prove that decentralization was a good thing, or no, decentralization is a bad thing. We say it's neither good nor bad, it's both things simultaneously. It all depends on how you do it and the context in which you take which actions. That's what determines. It will definitely have good or bad effects, but you can't say ex ante decentralization is a good or a bad thing any more than you can say ex ante democracy is a success or a failure. No, if we say, how do we evaluate democracy as a political form of government? Well, we have Switzerland and we have Sweden and we have Italy, but we also have Angola and we have Nigeria and we have Honduras and we have Haiti. So it's Bangladesh. It's very difficult to say democracy is a success or democracy is a failure. It depends. It can be extraordinarily successful and extraordinarily good, but it can also have very, very bad consequences. Decentralization is similar in that way, of a complex, multidimensional set of actions, political incentives and activities tied to resources and allocation across multidimensional space. We can say all of this with confidence because we document it here in this book, in the 13 chapters of this book. First order theorizing is not useful here. Decentralization is complicated, and reformers face a daunting set of choices as they design and execute real decentralization programs. These details are not trivial. They're not details that we can gloss over. They're crucial if decentralization is to fit a country's challenges. Getting decentralization is difficult. Getting decentralization right is difficult, but it's also immensely valuable because it can improve the quality of a country's governance. How do we get decentralization right? I can't give you a quick soundbite, a quick sentence or paragraph that tells you how to get it right because it's so context dependent. But if you know about the context in which you're designing a reform, you can get it right. So it can be got right for a country, for a region, for a city, but you need to know more information than we have right now at this table in this moment in order to do that. But broadly, by a combination of political and technocratic measures that work with the grain of national and subnational incentives in ways along the lines of what we've been talking about this afternoon to target resources and hold officials to account. If a political mechanism is failing, then try going through a design mechanism, kind of mechanism that can achieve the same outcome and may be able to do so in some cases more cheaply. If the design mechanism, if the technocratic measure is not working, then try a political mechanism that involves citizen participation and greater accountability. And through a combination of these things in different countries at different times, it's likely, we argue, that you can reach the outcomes that you want to reach in terms of accelerating development, targeting resources, benefits, and investment to the neediest populations, increasing economic growth, and making governance more transparent. The chapters in the book shine a light on how to do this. They answer questions about when and why decentralization works across the globe under very different conditions, what it can achieve when it works, and when and why it doesn't work or achieves bad outcomes. Lastly, let me close by saying, consider the climate of geopolitical discontent and unrest around the world today. Democracy seems to be stumbling everywhere. Making it more robust and more effective has never been more important. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Paul, for a fantastic presentation. And we will directly open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. I will also ask you to briefly introduce yourself. I think that there are some people online. So online, of course, you can ask questions as well. So are there any questions in the room? Dimitri, please.
Dimitri Sotiropoulos, Robert Schuman, this Center Fellow for a short term. Thank you for this very pragmatist and down-to-earth approach to decentralization. I have two very quick questions. The first is, to what extent decentralization in the way you described it, which can be good or bad, contributes to the diffusion of corruption. So in terms of corruption, would decentralization make corruption more diffuse? I'm asking this question because 30 years ago, I supported further decentralization for South European political systems, and the late Vincent Wright, whom many of you may remember, told me, you are a young, innocent Greek, you know nothing. If you have no control mechanisms in these countries or in other countries, the moment you start decentralizing, corruption will grow. So I was speechless. And the second question is regarding the cases of countries which are not democratic, where you have authoritarian regimes. What is the limit of decentralization beyond which an authoritarian regime like China would stop decentralization because it would become politically uncontrollable? Thank you.
Okay, two big questions. So I think we should take these one by one. Let me answer the first question on corruption in the following way. I did my PhD on decentralization in Bolivia, and the president of Bolivia, answering a question along these lines when he announced the reform, he was a very funny, sort of folksy fellow. And he said, everyone is criticizing me for this program, saying that all the money is going to get stolen by corrupt local politicians because off in the countryside, away from the La Paz and the big cities, you don't have smart people with masters from places like the EUI and the LSE, and so they're going to spend the money badly and they're going to steal the money. He said, my perception having worked in centralized government for my entire career, is that a great deal of the money is being stolen in the center as well, but it's being stolen by a tiny number of people. If this program has no other effect than dispersing the stealing amongst a large number of people in the countryside, it will have succeeded. Secondly, a second empirical point, in Bolivia, when they decentralized, there was a great deal of stealing in some localities, and in other localities, the money was spent remarkably well. And I spent years of my life doing qualitative as well as quantitative research, including lots of field work in places that were very corrupt and places that were not corrupt. And so you had both sets of things going on. In some of the places that were very corrupt, the mayor was dragged out in 3 or 4 rural municipalities on the Altiplano, places that have a very fierce kind of reputation. The mayor was dragged out of his house in the middle of the night, accused of thievery, evidence was shown to him, and he was burnt. They killed him and they burnt him by the neighbors in that locality. They said, "You've stolen the money. For years, you've been stealing the money. This is why we don't have a school. This is why our children don't know how to read. This is why we were promised a hospital. You received money for the hospital. There's no hospital. You stole it. We know you stole it," and they killed him. I don't endorse this. This is not my recommendation for a good thing to happen. But in those places, the following mayors, the mayors that followed him did not steal. So the point is that there is real accountability. This is a limiting, very dramatic example, but there was real local accountability because there was real local information on what was going on in that municipality in a way that there was not before, when all the decisions were taken by the ministries of health and education in La Paz. Nobody knew where the money went. The schools and the hospitals didn't get built, but nobody knew where the money went. In that locality, once the money was theirs, they knew where it went, they could see what was going on, and they could take action. In very many other hundreds of municipalities across Bolivia, there was binding accountability in ways that were not illegal and not immoral. There was binding accountability through sort of more democratic or popular pressure kinds of mechanisms. So I think my answer to your question, stepping back from these examples, is that yes, a country that decentralizes. So this is the classic counter argument is no, it's local governments are by nature corrupt, and we shouldn't decentralize because it will increase corruption. Well, my answer is that corruption is endemic to government at all levels of government. There's corruption at the local level, there's corruption at the meso level, there's corruption at the national level. The big difference in the last 50 years is that national governments used to be big compared to private interests. And today in the world, private interests are big compared to national governments. And I don't just mean developing countries like Bolivia, I mean Italy and the United States and the UK. Big rich individuals, a man or a woman with a name and an address, might be big and powerful in comparison to a national government. And so the idea that entrenched interests cannot capture national government policymaking, I think is just not believable. And I think we see it, and we see it in effect, even in the US, the biggest and richest democracy, at least for the moment. So I don't think that's right. And I think it's back to the point that I made in the presentation. It depends on how you decentralize. You can decentralize in a way that tends to increase corruption at local levels, but you can also decentralize in a way that tends to decrease corruption and hence decrease corruption nationwide. Because if you have relatively cleaner local governments and the money is being spent now locally and not nationally, this might lead to an aggregate decrease in corruption, which is what you saw in places like Bolivia, and other cases as well. Now, non-democratic limits, that's a great question, and I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows, because most of the studies on decentralization have been on democratic systems, and people have started using these frames and these empirical tools to study authoritarian decentralizations only very recently. The chapter in this book on China or the other chapter on Pakistan by Jean-Philippe Plateau and co-authors, or by Jared Padro, Monica Martinez Bravo, and co-authors on China, are some of the first really serious quantitative, methodologically rigorous studies of decentralization with a huge N in the hundreds of thousands of local governments in the case of China. So I think the literature is just not well enough developed to answer that question yet. But what I can say kind of anecdotally is that the Chinese have gone, in the course of editing this book, I was surprised at how much decentralization and how much democracy, local level democracy there is in China right now. And if the Communist Party begins to lose grip in China, it won't be because of that, it'll be because of other things. It's going to tend to be because of economic growth or a potential war with Taiwan or something that is a national level aggregate, not because of their decentralization policy. I think my takeaway from the chapter is that decentralization is helping to stabilize. The incremental effect of decentralization in China is to stabilize the non-democratic communist regime. So my guess, but it's not more than a guess, is that actually that limit could be pretty far advanced compared to what I would have thought before this book. Sorry, that was extensive answers.
No, excellent. Thank you. Yes, please, Eleanor.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Eleonora, the second year of SPS. I was wondering if the book describes any particular concrete pushes for reforms, like shocks or economic structural changes or something like that, you know? Because, I mean, yeah, it's a very difficult and multi-dimensional process, but are there any concrete, you know, factors that can push politicians to actually make a decision about the reform, and also if there is any differences between, again, democratic and authoritarian systems in this regard?
Yes, thank you. Those are a couple of great questions. We have several of the chapters look at this explicitly. So the chapter by Plateau et al. On Pakistan looks at relatively newly independent Pakistan after the breakup with Bangladesh, and how politics changed when there was a coup and the dictator wanted to stabilize his regime and remake what the authors argue was an emerging programmatic, meaning a sort of a typical 20th century left versus right, you know, more pro-poor versus more pro-business in the conventional sense that we think about left versus right politics emerging in Pakistan, and the way in which, because of course he had just overthrown that regime, meaning he'd overthrown all of the politicians and parties that were staffing that government and that politics. And so he tried to recreate Pakistani politics in a way that would support him as dictator. And that's when he Islamicized politics. That's when the Islamicization of Pakistani politics began. Pakistan was not born as a country with Islamic politics, even though it was an Islamic republic. It was born with an incipient left versus right system where you had people of varying religiosity on both sides of that divide. And so what he did was to Islamicize politics and to make that more potent and more successful, he brought in the great landowning elite families. He co-opted them into this political system, and he gave them obvious benefits from supporting the dictatorship. And he decentralized. So one of the curiosities of decentralization in Pakistan, and this has to do with Dimitri's question as well, is that as opposed to what we might think, Pakistan has decentralized 3 times in its independent existence, each time under a military regime immediately following a coup. And then when democratic politics returns, they get rid of decentralization and they re-centralize power. And then a generation later, there's another coup and another decentralization, and then the returning civilian government after that re-centralizes power. So it's a dynamic that is based on de facto rule, which is sort of unusual, but they're doing it for these sort of politically instrumental reasons. I think what's behind your question is actually related to a conference that I organized here last month at the beginning of December, which was trying to understand, in this case, decentralization through the lens of political necessity and what we call instrumental incoherence, meaning that the instrument that politicians use may be orthogonal to the sort of main effect that they're trying to achieve. So, for example, stabilizing a dictatorship, they decentralize, they devolve resources and power to people that are locally elected. That's not the obvious thing to do if you're a dictator who wants to stabilize your regime, but it may be functional in that context at that time to doing that. This is the kind of thing that Devraj and Kamani look at in their chapter, and the chapter on China and the other chapter on Pakistan look at it much more specifically in country level studies. So I think my quick answer is yes, it varies very much by country and by the moment in each country when a decentralization is pursued. There are countries where decentralization is pursued twice in the space of 20 or 25 years, but for very different reasons. The same reform is politically useful to different politicians at different moments for very different reasons. But if you look at it innocently from abroad, you might think, oh, well, they're just doing the same thing again. They're actually not. They're doing something that sounds like it's the same. Because they're doing it for different reasons, they then implement it in very different ways with different effects.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is Abbas Sibai. I'm a PLF fellow. And I come from Beirut, Lebanon, where like I've been in practice of local governance and working with the local municipalities for the last 15 years. I like the idea that when you approach on like the terms of like kind of politics in a sense, and also on the mechanism design, what's kind of like, how can I say, like the differences, or like where's like important to focus on decentralization from political intervention and where from more from the mechanism design? Like when you gave the example of like the bio cards, the biometric cards or the banking cards or something like this. And also like you talked at the beginning on the decentralization, for example, of education. Would be decentralization going by like bits and pieces, or it's like kind of a country by itself like need to take a decision on decentralization as a concept for like on several sectors, or could be strategic on like one sector, like public goods, water, or electricity, or these this type of intervention? And last question is about what would be kind of decentralization and social entrepreneurship in a sense of the power of like kind of, since you talked about the private sector getting more onto the national level, so maybe people are driven more on being more entrepreneur, but from a social dimension, and using decentralization as a tool. Thank you.
Good, thank you. What we're calling mechanism design versus political mechanisms is really sort of an intellectual convenience of trying to categorize things into two broad camps that have different characteristics. At the end of the day, it can be difficult when you have a particular mechanism or set of incentives or a particular program. You know, is this mainly political or is it mainly mechanism design? Well, it's a bit of both in the real world. But intellectually, it makes sense to think about different channels because they might operate in different ways. I think my answer to your question is that along the lines of my opening comments, is that there's no way for us or anyone to give a general blueprint type of recommendation, even specific to a particular goal. You should have so much politics and so much mechanism design in a solution to primary education or road construction or macroeconomic stability. It depends very much on the context. And let me give you an example of how. So the country that I've studied the most with respect to this is Bolivia. And it just so happens that Bolivia is a country that has relatively higher, what Putnam would call social capital,
account,
civic organization. Oh, sorry. Okay. So Bolivia has relatively high social capital and a density of civic organizations at the local level in a way that is not necessarily the case in all countries. And it's not symmetric across all of Bolivia, but there's a tendency in Bolivia to have a high degree of social organization that goes back to pre-Columbian times. It goes back to the Inca Empire and before that, the Tiwanacocha civilization, and so on, where the community organizations, self-governing communities were very dispersed across a very big area, twice the size of France, relatively sparsely populated. And so the local community was traditionally very strong and has been very strong for 1,000 years or more. In that context, you can decentralize and depend on citizen participation and political mechanisms to a much higher degree than in places where you don't have that high level of civic organization. In some countries you do, in some countries you don't. And even in Bolivia, in places where you have very high degrees of migration, for example, and communities are very mixed up in terms of different linguistic and religious groups, then you don't have that level of social organization that you have in stable communities where families have lived there for generations. And so even within Bolivia, you may need different mixes of political versus mechanism design features. In places where you have high civic organization, you can rely on politics and you don't need to worry about mechanism design so much. If the political things aren't working, then you can turn to decision rules, to biometric identification, to technocratically tied benefits or programs that operate in a way that doesn't go through politics, because maybe politics is weaker because of the lack of civic organization. So the first thing, it's a bit like being a doctor. You take the symptoms, the temperature, you look at the physical attributes of the patient before you start to make a diagnosis and then lay out a course of treatment. You would never lay out a course of treatment when the patient is behind a blind and you can't see or hear them. So in the same way with policy, you need to know what the characteristics are. I'll jump to the third question because I missed the second question. I'm sorry. Maybe you can remind me in a moment. The third question, the private sector, yes, this is one of the most exciting developments in development generally over the last generation. I see it clearly in my students at the LSE, where 25 years ago, the brightest ones all seemed to want to go work for the World Bank or the IMF or something like that. And now the most ambitious, there's still a healthy group of students that want to do that, and that's fine. But the most ambitious, most interesting students want to go off and found their own social enterprise or NGO or some kind of group that's difficult to characterize. It's not for profit, but it's not really a public sector. It's not really an NGO. It's kind of, and they don't care. They have a bright idea and they can raise capital and they can do something that has a social impact and raise capital on the basis of that. And put together a team and achieve a result, and also have access to public sector decision-making and resources, national and international, in a way that, going back to the 1970s and 80s just wasn't possible. So I think, and decentralization can work with that in ways that I think are really interesting. So your second question.
More or less, you already answered on it regarding selecting a sector or not, in a sense of should be like a full-fledged on kind of decentralization as a full-fledged part, or could be like waste management or water or electricity. So, but
I can say a little bit more about that. I sort of mentioned it in passing. It's an important topic. So a lot of chapter 2 is directly about that. And so the collected wisdom of 50 years of fiscal federalism studies go directly to that issue. What sorts of public services and public investment authority should be devolved to which level? And we actually have answers to that. The answer does not take the form, education should be here, health should be there. Of course, it depends, but we have decision rules or decision criteria. In general, the larger the economies of scale, for example, the more a service or a decision power should be retained by higher levels of government. By contrast, the more locally specific the benefit is, then the further down you can decentralize that service to a lower level of government. And so, for example, the sort of canonical examples are waste collection and waste management can be pushed down very far to a local level of government typically, as can primary education, because there are few spillovers. The third criterion is spillovers. So where you have a high degree of spillovers to a larger population, then then you look at who's benefiting, you look at the footprint geographically of who's benefiting from that service, from that hospital or that university or that secondary school, and you locate authority for that infrastructure and that service at that level of government. So a primary school can be local level, a secondary school might be 2 or 3 localities. A university is almost always regional or national because the footprint of a university will be national or regional. Again, depending on the, are we talking about Brazil or are we talking about Dubai? No, I mean, very different scales. Yeah, so there are, chapter 2 goes into that in a great deal of detail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Virginia, first year Max Weber Fellow. So from what I've understood, I will take the liberty to put it in my own words. You mentioned that one of the positive effects of decentralization, taking, for instance, local elections, can be the fact that we can select better representatives and people will be more able to punish or reward the politicians. And I was thinking about clarity of responsibility. And I'll take Brazil as an example because it is the case that I know the most. So just 2 anecdotes. We have a high problem with public security. I think everybody knows that. And a lot of people blame on the president, but this is a state level responsibility. And also recently we had floods in Rio de Janeiro, the state, not the capital, and people were calling out for the mayor of Rio de Janeiro to do something. But he couldn't do something because it wasn't his responsibility to do something. So I was wondering what the book can tell us about the relationship between decentralization and clarity of responsibility. Thank you.
So that's a very good point. It's a subtle point. Any good decentralized system has to have transparency and clarity to citizens, in particular in a democratic system like Brazil, about who is responsible for what. And let me back up and say that there's a tendency, and sometimes the models, especially in the older generation of studies, including my own, my first writings on this 27 years ago, tend to oversimplify in the sense of suggesting to the reader that when you decentralize, you get rid of national government, or it no longer matters, at least with respect to the services that we're studying. And now all of the action is at the local or regional level, right? The municipal or state level. And that's never true anywhere, anytime, including with the most local services like waste management or street lighting, for example. When you decentralize, what you do, to use an ugly word, is to complexify service provision. You devolve primary responsibility for decision-making and maybe even resource raising, let's say, to a municipal government. But that municipal government will continue to work in a context of overlapping responsibility and fiscal flows that go up and down the system with regional and national government. They need to work together. What you do is to create a more complex system that hopefully is more robust to shocks. So if you have terrible flooding in one state or one city, then the mayor needs to do something, but not by himself. He or she needs to work with the state government in Brazil and with the national government. The national government will make funds available, but the mayor is not going to be sidelined. They can't, it's not the case that all the decisions will happen in Brasilia and the people you said in Rio de Janeiro? Yeah, in Rio are not, the politicians, leaders in Rio are not going to be sidelined in terms of disaster relief and then reconstruction. They need to be involved because the services and the infrastructure they have responsibility for, and they're going to have to maintain, and they have better information about local need. They have to generate the resources to carry that forward, et cetera. So what you do is you generate a complex system, which is why transparency is so important. On the other hand, this kind of political buck passing, passing the pelota, passing the ball back and forth, is just typical to democratic systems in particular. I mean, also non-democratic, but it's particularly potent in democratic systems. And the fact that they blame each other in the eyes of in the moment of a crisis is not a failure of the system. It's sort of a predictable dynamic. It's a bit silly. It's a bit childish. But you get upset when a child cries because you take away the chocolate because they've had enough, but that doesn't mean it's a bad child. It's just sort of a predictable response that you need to move beyond. So the bottom line is that citizens need to know clearly who has responsibility for what, and then they need to see who is doing what in response to a crisis like a flood or to an ongoing need like for better health or better education services. And to the extent that there's greater transparency, then there can be greater accountability in this complex system in which different levels have to work together. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I'm Deborah Mabbitt from Birkbeck in London. I'm going to ask a question, I guess, inspired by, if that's the right word, the UK example. If you look at the UK, you'd say a big cost of decentralization is the loss of equalization. And I just wondered if you could say something about that in the context of the countries that your study has focused on. Is it that equalization between poor and rich areas was never happening anyway, or do you think equalization can be compatible with decentralization, or how do you see that unfolding in your cases?
Equalization is an enormously important and necessary part of decentralization, I would say, in any country in the world, certainly in the vast majority of countries in the world. It's an empirical question how much you need and how much you should undertake. But in general, and linking this to Virginia's question, in a properly, so if we take the fiscal federal wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of 50 years, and we look at any particular country, so say, for example, the UK, you would generate predictions about which services should be decentralized to which level of government, and then almost the necessary consequence of that is that especially local level governments are going to have too much loaded onto them that they can't finance, too much in the sense of their ability to raise taxes. And so they're going to need transfers, taxation. So the national government is just more efficient and better capable of raising large sums of money. Right. What you don't want is a race to the bottom. You don't want to generate a harmful competition amongst localities to undertax businesses or capital, leading businesses, for example, to move across a locality frontier to the neighboring municipality because taxes are low. You don't want to generate an incentive for that sort of race to the bottom. So you locate that sort of taxation across mobile assets at the national level, which means the national level is always going to be easier. We'll always find it easier to generate large amounts of taxation, which it needs to share with the local government, which by right, by economic logic and in terms of the political logic of accountability, should be doing things like not only waste management and public lighting, but primary education and primary health care, and a number of other cultural and infrastructural activities, which it can't finance fully, right? So you always have to have some kind of equalization. There are, broadly speaking, two forms of equalization. As chapter 2 goes into this in detail, there are two forms of equalization. One is this sort of equalization that I'm talking about now, which is equalization about needs, between where a kind of provision should be located by rights, and then the ability of a lower level of government. It might also be a meso level of government to generate sufficient resources. The other sort of equalization is, I think, what you meant in your question, which is between richer and poor localities. So between Kensington and London and Tower Hamlets, let's say. Now, so you need equalization from richer to poorer regions of a city, of a country, etc. And a well-ordered decentralization system should have both forms of equalization happening simultaneously, but ideally in a way that encourages transparency so citizens can see so much money, so much equalization flows are going in terms of horizontal equalization between richer and poor, and these other flows are pursuing the vertical equalization target, which is between needs and ability to raise money. And that should be part. So you're right that the UK government hasn't done it, and so this is why their decentralization program is really partial and lacking. So Exhibit A of Devarajan and Kemani's argument that decentralizations are always partial, look at the UK. The UK devolved under Tony Blair in response to the situation in Northern Ireland, and that, I think that was a noble aspiration, and it seemed to work. But the decentralization program that emerged from that is really screwed up. I mean, it's incomplete. Different regions of the country have different powers that don't make any particular sense. It was really done on an entirely political basis. The bulk of the country has no devolution. Why don't you have any English regional governments that matter at all? You have relatively powerful city government. I mean, not compared to cities in Brazil or Germany, but within the UK, in places like London and Manchester, but not really so much elsewhere. It doesn't make any sense. It's all made up on the hoof. And, you know, proper decentralization system would actually normalize all of this.
Please.
Adrienne Riquier is Emerita Professor at the SPS department. My question goes to your kind of last point when you said the success of decentralization depends entirely on the context. And now in the discussion, we also went to the type of policy really which you want to realize as a part of the context. If you indeed want to realize a distributive policy from the center, you can't decentralize. If it would be a kind of transfer of taxes from one part of the country to another part of the country, you couldn't decentralize. So the context is also a feature of the particular policy you talk about. And a lot of the services which you have been mentioning, of course, like education, primary education, you depend entirely on information from the bottom up of what the needs are at the local level. So again, it depends again on the type of policy you're talking about, the type of service you talk about, or whether it's or building roads across the entire country in order to create a certain coherence in the country, of course, would not depend now on decentralization. So to what extent do you systematize the policy features which then lend themselves to decentralization or not? That's one point. And the other point I wanted to ask is, I thought it was really interesting when you said in China you have local democracy. And I was wondering, why wouldn't it then scale? Can't you scale this democracy upwards, right? And which obviously doesn't happen. And then you said, well, it's actually used something as in order buffering the center from demands of democratization, right? As long as you have it at the local level, there will be no requirements as to democratization at the national level. But still, the scale-up aspect is always interesting also because, as you rightly said, there is a room for experimentation at the local level and policy innovation depending on local contexts. And of course, very often you see, like, for instance, in the US, that experiments, like, for instance, California, CO2 emissions in the car industry, has traveled across the entire United States. Therefore, you can kind of scale up innovative solutions, which then may travel across the entire country, which is a particular, I think, important feature also of decentralization.
Thank you, Adrian. Now, two very, very important issues. So on the first one, I would resist trying to systematize, if I understand you correctly, trying to systematize recommendations about how exactly to decentralize, because I think it is so context dependent. So I would rather lay out, explain dynamics, explain them empirically in places where we've researched them, and then lay out the sorts of incentives or the sorts of tendencies, and then leave it to people in different countries who are designing a decentralization reform to take account of their context and their reality and design something that's the first best, intellectually, the first best response And then it's down to politicians to decide whether this is politically feasible or desirable or not, which is why any real decentralization program is such a series of compromises, or such a series, it's a multi-level negotiated outcome of people with very different sorts of incentives, as distinct from the way that the literature progressed going back 30 or 40 years, where people began with typically economic criteria and said, well, this service has this sorts of characteristics, and so it should be located here, which is a nice sort of seminar game to play, but doesn't reflect anything in the real world, and doesn't tend to happen anywhere in the real world because of all the other things that we're talking about. But on your example about transfers, well, I'm going to call it a successful decentralized system, by which I mean one that endures in time and has some positive effects that we can empirically identify. And there are a number of countries that would fall into that category. In any successful decentralized system, you have an important transfer function that's going on, and it is, you're right, it's carried on by higher levels of government, typically by the national government, or in very big countries like Brazil or India, an important degree of transfer is happening at the state level as well, in addition to the national level. So decentralization doesn't mean that you lose that ability. As I mentioned in response to some of the previous questions, decentralization is about complexifying service. You go from so if we do a mental experiment of going from a very highly centralized country, and there have existed many of these exist in the world today. If we go back to the 1950s and 60s in the immediate post-colonial setting, there are very many countries in the developing world that were super highly centralized, where essentially all decision-making happened at the national level in the capital city by national government. So this isn't just a kind of a fake exercise. If we go from a highly centralized system to a well-ordered decentralized system, you don't necessarily lose the ability of government to do anything, but you do make a great number of things more complex because you have more actors at different hierarchical levels with different incentives, and you need to design the system in a way that makes them want to cooperate to produce education, health, roads, dams, poverty alleviation, rich to poor transfers, etc. All of these things can happen, but they're going to happen with more people intervening. Ideally, that also means more citizen participation and better information than when all the decision happened in Nairobi or in Bogota or in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. India is a bad example because India was born as a federal state. So I think that's my answer, that any design needs to be context dependent in the way that you pointed out, but you don't necessarily lose functionality because the central government will always be there and will always be intimately involved in any well-ordered centralized system. Let me also add, just because it's I think it's sort of coming up sotto voce in a number of these questions, that a well-ordered decentralized system, in addition to being more complex, should be more robust. So in a highly centralized system, if you have, for example, floods in one part of the country and all the decision-making depends on one minister, and that minister is inept or corrupt or both, then you in the places that got flooded, too bad. You're not going to have a good response because everything relies on that one person. In a decentralized system, in a big federal country like Brazil that has additionally decentralization, the federal government may be inept, but you have a state and local governments, and they may be able to do at least something to alleviate your problems, to continue providing services, even if the minister is bad. Or if the mayor is bad, you still have the central government and the regional government that can do something and provide a response. So the citizen has more options and also a greater possibility of using one of these other levels to try to bring pressure to bear on the failing level in a way that doesn't happen in a highly centralized regime. Now, think of the environmental disasters that we got, for example, in Eastern Europe under communism. These were highly centralized systems where there weren't multiple levels with independent legitimacy and independent authority. It was all dependent on one line of authority, and that design is brittle. When it breaks, it's gone, and there's very little that citizens can do. And then your second question about the lab, I think of this as the laboratory analysis of decentralization, that it creates lots of subnational laboratories of policy making that can try different things. And then if one is successful, it can generalize across the system. That's part of the genius of decentralization and federalism that you don't have in a federal system. A federal system, sorry, you don't have in a centralized system. A centralized system could choose to do that. The dictator could choose to experiment in one place, but the incentives are not nearly as strong, A, for the experimentation and B, for the adoption, as they are in a federal decentralized system, where subnational politicians are trying to show that they're better than the neighbors. And so you get that kind of California effect that, so I mean, I think that's very powerful. And you have a decentralization sets up a system of incentives that lead towards that in a way that centralization doesn't, and I think largely can't.
Thank you. Some of it relates to what Adrienne just said. So while I have great sympathies with your tendency to say, let's look at decentralization, that is not always a bad thing, because if we look at it, fiscal federalism, the functional fiscal federalism really, in a way, had all kinds of arguments that it said centralization would be better. Even the one stabilization, because it only can be done for the whole at the central level, redistribution leads to race to the bottom, at least financing it should be a central level. And even when you look at public goods provision, allocation, in the end, if you don't want to have completely segregated communities according to tax capacity of the locals, then you need to have strong central intervention. So I like the challenge you take up from knowing that you come from economics. But what was behind your thinking when you thought about this whole project? What would ex ante make one think that, at least in political sense, for democracy, it might be better to decentralize? Because as soon as I think about it, not only the corruption problem or such things, but also local oligopolies, the logic of collective action, that the higher concentrated the interests are, the more they will have an incentive to raise their voice, to lobby the capital for getting things to them, but not the people who are busy with their daily lives at the level of sometimes, really having to work very hard to just make a living. So why should there be any link between effective democracy and decentralization is my question, I guess.
Very good. Challenging the title of the book. That's good. Thank you, Valtrad. Well, that's maybe the biggest question of all. And especially, so I think this is, my answer is general, but I'm going to make it in developing country context, because that's what we focus on in the book, and because the developing world is the vast majority of the world's people and spaces and countries. It's, again, think in terms of a stylized contrast between a highly centralized and a highly decentralized government. And again, underlying that these are real examples that really happened, in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, as they move from post-colonial to more democratic systems. It's much easier and much more likely for typical citizens, meaning in developing countries, relatively poor people without a lot of resources and without a lot of time, to participate democratically in a decentralized system than in a centralized system, because the transaction costs are just lower. Because they can go and complain and make demands and try to hold to account politicians who live in the same places as they do, as opposed to 1,000 miles away in the capital city. If I flip my comment, then I would say you can have a highly centralized developing country government that is participative and responsive to citizen needs, but it requires a highly altruistic set of politicians running that government to go out of their way to make themselves sensitive to what local people need and want, because they have to go and find the citizens and take the temperature of what's going on and find out what are the problems and where is government failing, or what needs do they have that aren't being attended to, and respond, or they can sit in the heights of their central government offices and ignore these people, and these people will never find their way to them because they don't have the time and they don't have the presence as citizens. These are people who may be semi-literate or illiterate. I'll give you a couple of stylized examples from places that I've studied in depth in terms of field work and qualitative research. After decentralization, I saw bands of rural peasants turning up. One day I was there to interview some local officials, and these peasants kind of, pushed me aside and started banging on the door of the mayor and saying, "We have 50 people in our community." I'm paraphrasing in my own pointy-headed way. Average family size is 6. That means 300 citizens. We know that the per capita distribution, because the central government made a big hullabaloo about how much money per capita was being distributed under decentralization. So we know that it was 150 Bolivianos per capita. We have 300 people. We have 300 people. And so we know that our hamlet got so many thousands of Bolivianos, and the roof of the school is still leaking and is still fallen in part of the school, and a year has gone by. Why aren't you doing anything about this? There is no chance that these people could have brought that kind of pressure to bear on the Ministry of Education 3 years before, when all such decisions were taken in La Paz. There's just no way. They couldn't have physically gotten there. If they had managed to get to La Paz, which is about 1,000 kilometers away, then what would they have done? They couldn't have gotten into the building. People dressed as peasants getting up the bus, would not have had an audience with the minister, the vice minister, the director, the vice director, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with anybody with decision-making power. But they could come and bang on the door. The mayor tried to run away, and they found him. And he had, but I mean, he had a strong incentive to listen, or he was going to lose every single vote in that community, and the other communities would find out about it. So, what we've seen is that a well-ordered decentralization program which sets up incentives and has a fair amount of transparency that's built into it can generate more citizen participation, and in that sense, more democracy and a better quality of democracy. After Bolivia decentralized, voter turnout went out 127% over a 2-year period between the previous election and the first local election for local officials after decentralization. So it more than doubled. Why? Because people were voting for local officials over whom they felt excitement at the time, that they thought that, and that, by the way, that wasn't a blip. So that was a step change that remained, that continued going up after decentralization. It never then came back down to the previous. Why? Because central government had a strong incentive to suppress participation and suppress voting, especially in rural areas that they wanted to ignore, so they could spend all the money in the cities, which is where they won and lost elections, because it was more difficult to insulate themselves from urban citizens, whereas it was easier for them to insulate themselves from rural citizens. Decentralization makes that impossible, because there's now a mayor in each rural place, and they have to respond. So I'm kind of mixing arguments with anecdotal examples, but I again, very simplifying hugely. When we talk about decentralization, we're not decentralizing everything. We're not getting rid of central government, and we're not decentralizing all public functions. Defense policy and monetary management are always going to be at the national government. That's never going to be decentralized. It makes no sense from any kind of economic or political perspective. So what are we talking about decentralizing? We're talking about decentralizing to low levels of government, services and infrastructures that really fundamentally affect those local people and no one else. Where they affect a larger footprint of people, then you decentralize to a higher level of subnational government, which might be state or provincial governments. And then when the natural footprint of a service is national, that doesn't get decentralized at all. No? So somebody who wants to argue that we should not have decentralization needs to explain to me why people in this locality should not have a direct say over services that affect fundamentally them and no one else in the country. And anyone who wants to make that argument, to me, to my mind, is not a Democrat. They don't believe in democracy.
I'm very curious, because I wanted to ask you this question to get a bit of your your thinking behind this. Is this a kind of Ostrom argument, as she had against the tragedy of the commons, you're saying against this notion, you know, against costs in a way? Transaction costs, nobody wants to carry them. So if I can free ride on Adrienne to do all the job for me, then I will just lay back and wait for Adrienne to do the thing, to get politically active, to ask for things. And you say this is not how, at least in a local community where the benefits are tangible, schools for our children, whatever, is that Coasian logic is just idiotic. It would not work. People act politically in that respect and know that they have collectively to do something about it. Is that your thinking?
Empirically, yes. So I'm not willing to write a paper that makes a theoretical argument along the lines of what you're saying, because I'm not sure. But what I see again and again and again in places where I do research, and the results of all the quantitative and qualitative research in works like the chapters in this book, are that especially at local levels of government, people will band together and they will volunteer their time and bear some amount of costs, and they seem to get some, what Ostrom would say maybe, is that they get some kind of benefit through the collective action, which, even though it's also a cost in terms of their time, and they may even, you know, give up some income earning opportunities, but these sorts of, I mean, why do people go to a community fete, you know, to a community party, a community celebration? In very many countries, every locality will have, in Latin America, it's Saints' Day, or the day of the founding of the community, or the day when the community comes together to celebrate something or another, that may be religious or civic or whatever. People could be out working the fields, or, you know, at their shops trying to sell something, and yet they don't do that because they enjoy it. They enjoy this. Plato said, "Man is a social animal." You know? So they enjoy the interaction. They enjoy, at some level, investing in the ties of the community. And that translates into public service provision as well. I don't think you can dump costs onto poor peasants, but you can rely on them to elicit information and also to do a certain amount of monitoring where politicians and policymakers may be going wrong, because it's in their interest to do so, but also because they enjoy doing it, because they enjoy the sense of collective action. You know, it generates some sort of psychological or cultural benefit for them. I think my final answer is empirically we observe it, and I think maybe the Homo economicus is just too restrictive. It's not just, you know, a very cold financial cost benefit sort of thing. People like living in their community and they invest in their community, and they're willing to do this as well.
Okay, I'm not sure whether there is a question. If not, perhaps I will use the freedom to ask a question myself. And I will probably, I will push you in a direction that you may not like, and it will be a very naive question. But the book says basically that decentralization is not a thing. And basically it doesn't lead to good or bad outcomes, or it's not good or bad. And that it's somehow similar to democracy. But when it comes to democracy, there were authors who claimed that democracy is not necessarily that good for some countries, for some stages of development. For instance, we can think of Samuel Huntington in the 1960s, and recently Francis Fukuyama claims that we need a strong state first, and this is more conducive to democratic development and only, or to economic development, and only then we need accountability. And so if we accepted this kind of argument, it may be wrong, but if we accepted it, then we could think similarly about decentralization, right? Because the examples that were mentioned here were quite optimistic about the behavior of citizens, but we can also think about clientelistic practices that are easier at a smaller scale, where you can more control the constituency, and basically you can adopt corrupt means in order to get elected. So for instance, there is research that shows that when turnout is low, clientelism is easier to put in place. And so it's a question of scale to some extent. And if you have a smaller unit, clientelism should be easier to practice. And also, you said that decision makings becomes more difficult, more complex, and potentially we could think of veto players. There are more veto players in a decentralized system. And so based on all this, one could provocatively argue that perhaps decentralization is not that great for economically less developed countries, and it may be more appropriate for economically developed nations. How would you argue with that?
Good, very provocative. I would say a couple of things. So my most simple-minded counter-argument is that the leading countries in the world today were much less democratic at the sort of dawn of their democracies. You know, the UK, in real terms, in the early 1800s, was only barely a democracy. Very few people could vote. They were all men. They were all, you know, landowning, literate, upper-class twats. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Upper-class toffs is the word. And the franchise extended hugely. They became far more democratic. Women got the vote only in the 20th century, and larger numbers of people could vote and did vote. And the UK is vastly wealthier today in real terms under any measure than it was when it was less democratic. Exactly the same thing is true of the US. Exactly the same thing is true of Canada, Australia, Germany, France, etc. So the simplest answer is the leading countries are quite decentralized and quite democratic, and it hasn't gotten in the way of their becoming vastly richer than when they were less decentralized and less democratic. But you can nonetheless say that the right level of decentralization is geared towards a certain stage of development, and so developing countries should not decentralize yet until they become wealthier. And I would say I still don't believe that empirically, because countries that have decentralized have not started growing more slowly. In fact, very many of them have started growing more rapidly, and not just over the few years following a reform, but over a generation. Now, we're talking decentralization as a phenomenon really begins in the mid-20th century, so we don't have hundreds of years of data available, but we can look at the last 50 years of data, and there's no clear empirical correlation between decentralization and decreasing economic growth or decreasing development. And if I focus not so much on economic, but on human development, where we're talking about education, health, and human rights, then I would argue positively that decentralization is positively tied to faster human development because of the reasons that we were talking about with Waltraud. You know, because by deepening democracy and by creating stronger subnational levels of government that are more accountable to citizens, the citizens can help it do things that they want. And poor people are not, you know, they may be ignorant, but they're not stupid. They know that better education, better health are the key for them, or at least their children, to get a better life. One of the stunning regularities across countries and across political systems, across cultures, is that poor people want more education for their kids. It seems like a universal thing. No, it's not just the development experts who are talking about this. It's the poor parents, it's the poor farmers who don't know how to read, but they want their children to learn how to read. They're so immensely proud when their children learn how to read. No, and it's, you know, in Africa and Latin America and Asia, I've seen this again and again and again. And so if they can hold their local governments to account, then they can help to ensure that higher, faster human development is achieved. And we see, so again, I have these numbers on the tip of my mind because I spent so long studying them. In Bolivia, under centralization, under a very highly centralized regime, from 1825 until 1994, the national government chose to invest nothing in the vast majority of Bolivian towns and villages. So if you look at 7 years before decentralization, the central government in those 7 years chose to invest nothing in 40% of all Bolivian municipalities in terms of education. And I mean by nothing, I mean zero. I mean mathematically zero. And after decentralization, 97% of municipalities invested immediately. And by the third year, 100% of municipalities were investing in education. So decentralization just helped to push forward human development, no question. So then you might say, and this would be the Etzel-Coley kind of argument. Well, okay, but it's going to get in the way through dispersing resources and possibly accelerating corruption and making decision-making more difficult. It'll get in the way of economic growth. So I find it hard to make a strong argument, a parallel argument like I've just made for human development with respect to economic development, but we just don't observe it in practice.
Thank you. That was a great answer. So I think that we will probably slowly wrap it up. Thank you again for your fantastic presentation. I think that we can give Jean-Paul another round of applause.
Thank you all of you.
And I would like just to call your attention to the fact that there will be another event of the cluster on Friday, January 19. So this Friday at 3 p.m. there is a roundtable on strengthening the democracy dimension of the EU enlargement. We will have 4 invited speakers who will discuss what can be done to boost the Europeanization and democratization of candidate countries. So it will be in Sala del Capitolo here at the EUI and on Zoom. So that's it. Thank you again and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.